and Peruvians of a wide variety of networks of belonging. I also sense, though, that these networks of belonging went beyond the Aprista exile community in Chile. It went beyond that moment in time, and indeed often went beyond Chile and Peru. So many of the cultural organizations that I'll be investigating, and congresses and revistas, that brought together Chilean and Peruvian intellectuals, were continental, were not based in Chile or Peru. So I'm thinking particularly of the El Repertorio Americano, which was directed by Joaquin Garcia Monge in Costa Rica. I'm also thinking of the Pan-American Union. So many of these sites of encounter were continental. Many of them were global. So one instance, for example, is the the Institute for Intellectual Cooperation, which was based in Paris and linked to the United Nations. That included Gabriela Mistral. It also included some Peruvian intellectuals. We could also think about the Congreso de Americanistas, or the Congreso de las Razas, which I found took place in London in 1911 and involved both Chileans and Peruvians. There's just a couple more points that I want to make with regard to this slide, and then a couple of things about theoretical frameworks that I want to talk about the project more broadly, and then I'll move on to Chambi in Chile. By listing the sites of encounter that I'm interested in, I think also indicates the primary source material I'll be working with on the project. So documents pertaining to different cultural organizations, actas of various congresses, journals themselves, the indexes of journals, the catalogues of publishing houses. And one source that I'll be looking at closely, and doesn't appear explicitly here, is correspondence between intellectuals as well. And second, I want to stress that one of the key objectives of the project is not only to understand better Chilean and Peruvian ideas about race during the first half of the 20th century, but also I'm very interested in how these ideas were circulating. And I'm very interested in the mechanisms and the vehicles through which these ideas about race were communicated. Okay. Now, I have to admit that I don't yet have a clear theoretical framework for this project, but I think I'm starting to clarify my ideas about what kinds of approaches might be useful for me, and I'm going to talk just about a couple here. Stephen Vertovec provides a really useful summary of the phenomenon known as transnationalism, and on the widespread academic interest in transnationalism in his book, oddly titled Transnationalism. He defines transnationalism as, quote, economic, social, and political linkages between peoples, places, and institutions crossing nation-state borders and spanning the world. Now, what I'm talking about in this project are most definitely transnational encounters, but what I like, or what I find useful about the term transnational, is that it acknowledges the existence of national borders, that it acknowledges the existence of national boundaries at the same time as it's all about transcending those national boundaries. So, for example, and here I come back again to Ciro Alegría, he talks a lot about a shared American identity, a shared Andean identity with Gabriela Mistral. But he also articulates a very close identification with Peru, with his mi patria, mi país, mi pueblo. He talks about that a lot. So he talks about both at the same time. I've also been thinking a lot about what digital humanities has to offer and what we might gain from a quantitative reading of Chilean-Peruvian intellectual networks. Franco Moretti has this really intriguing book called Graphs, Maps and Trees, in which he argues for the value of a distant reading. and the need to move from exceptional events or specific seminal texts to a larger mass of facts. With fewer detailed elements, he says, we get a sharper sense of the overall connections. He's particularly interested in mapping out the world of the 19th century novel in England, and his starting point is that a scholar of the 19th century novel can never read all the novels of the 19th century, so that maybe it's helpful to step back a little bit and gather together that mass of facts about those novels: who's writing what, when, where, who's publishing, what are the main themes of the book, rather than, or often as well as reading in detail some of the novels, no? So I started to think that it might be useful to start putting together a data set of the large mass of facts of Chilean-Peruvian intellectual encounters. Which editoriales in Chile were publishing Peruvian authors? At what point? With what dates? With what print runs? What cost were the books being sold at? Which Peruvian authors were they publishing? And also, if you start mapping out what other authors they were publishing at the same time, can you get a sense of the proportion that, say, an editorial like Nacimiento, is it published? Is 10% of its books published by Peruvian authors? 3% if you map it out in comparison to the nationalities of other authors that it's publishing. We could also do this with journals, going through the indexes of the major journals in Peru and Chile, and again looking at what they're publishing when, who they're publishing and when. Once we've got this data in a kind of access relational database, you could start to run some this is where you can see this is very new for me. Some computational analysis over the data and see what a machine gives us, see what a machine takes, what it tells us. Social network analysis can also be helpful here to with this material to kind of tease out the hubs, or the central nodes, if you like, of Chilean-Peruvian intellectual networks, the key players, the key institutions. Now, we might not find out anything from this that we didn't already know, or that we didn't already have a sense of. So it's clear, without doing this, that Gabriela Mistral is a major intellectual figure in the early 20th century, and that she links many different Latin American intellectuals. We could say the same of the Mexican José Vasconcelos. But it could help to provide more concrete evidence of this, and it could help to visualize it in different ways as well. So I've started, I'll just talk about this for like 2 minutes and then move on. I've started putting together a data set of Gabriela Mistral's correspondence, from published collections of her letters, from secondary literature that mentions her letters, electronic and library-based archives of her unpublished letters, and noting who she wrote to, who wrote to her, where they were from, and when. So we might begin to get a broader sense, for example, of where Peruvians fit into her epistolary, I can't pronounce that word very well, networks. And we can also look at what she writes about, obviously, in the letters. Now, there are some major problems with this kind of analysis. So I've input about 400 different letters. It just so happens that one of the sources I've used is a collection of letters between the Argentine Victorio Campo and Mistral that Elizabeth Oran and Doris Mayer put together. Now, in that, there's 130 letters. So so far my data set of 400 letters, there's 130 or so with a Argentine. That would make it look like at least a quarter of her letters were with Argentines. But of course, it's been skewed by the fact that many people pick on specific figures that she's writing with, and produce books of that correspondence. If we digitize all her letters, again, we can start potentially doing some quite exciting things with them. This is an example of it not being so exciting. This is a word cloud, a very basic word cloud that we can take from the letters of a collection of Ciro Alegria's letters to Gabriela Mistral that were published as part of the collection Epistolario Americano. Now, it's not very useful at the moment. I'm not sure if it tells us anything that's very useful, partly because I have to do a more refined search and take out very common words, like usted or también. That doesn't really tell us anything. But one thing I do notice is that in a word cloud of 200, 300 words taken from letters from Ciro Alegria to Mistral, not once does the word indio or indígena or raza appear. So it makes me start to think, okay, am I looking for something that's not there or that's not there prominently? No. It's also, I thought, maybe interesting that Chile and Peru are here, but not America and not El Continente. Okay, so I think we have to be very careful and very wary of this quantitative approach to study of intellectual networks, not least because it misses out, quite obviously, the human dimension of those networks. But I think it's worth at least exploring what it might have to offer us and how it might help us to understand better Chilean-Peruvian intellectual connections. Of course, I think it only makes sense to do it in conjunction with in-depth studies, of specific intellectual encounters. The bigger picture makes no sense without a detailed understanding of the smaller parts that make up that bigger picture. So now I come on to one of those smaller parts. Much brilliant work has already been written on the indigenous Peruvian photographer Martin Chambi. I'm thinking particularly of Deborah Poole's work, also Jorge Coronado, James Scora, Andres Garay, and a number of others. Now, what emerges from this scholarship, either directly or indirectly, is that it's very difficult to impose a unifying narrative on Chambi, either on him and his life story or on his photography, which is why he's such a fascinating figure. So, for example, his most renowned photographs, like this one, titled, it's had a couple of different titles given it by different curators, but is often usually referred to as El Indio y su llama. His most renowned photographs, like this one, and this is one of the photographs that he took to Chile in 1936, tend to idealise and romanticize indigenous peoples. They also seem to prioritise the indigenous past, especially his photos of archaeological ruins, his most famous photographs of Machu Picchu. They also seem to prioritise an indigenous past over an indigenous present. And yet in other photographs, for instance, his photograph of indigenous campesinos awaiting trial in a courthouse in Cusco, or these amazing photographs of him and his friend Mario Yanez on brand new motorbikes set against a background of the urban poverty in Cusco. Here we see indigenous people clearly as active historical subjects who, as Jorge Coronado says, quote, both resist and demand a space in modernity. So we can find like these kind of simple stories in Chambi's photographs. We can also find much more complicated stories. Now, Chambi himself straddled the traditional and the modern, in early 20th century Peru, or the first half of 20th century Peru, speaking Quechua and Spanish, maintaining strong sentimental ties with his tierra, whilst mastering the modern technology of photography and making a decent living from that photography. Now, James Scora talks of Chambi's ethnic elasticity. I think it's also important to talk about his political elasticity. Chambi did not openly affiliate with any one particular political organisation or political party. He took photographs celebrating Cusco's elites, no, and numerous different events in which they were involved. He also used photography, though, to protest against inequality and injustice. So this meant that Chambi could work for many different groups, many different people. I'm really interested in this history of the reception of Chambi and the reception of his photography. I'm particularly interested in what happens to his photographs and through his photographs when he exhibits them in Chile in 1936. So Chambi is in Chile in 1936 for approximately 3 months between February and May 1936. Martin Chambi was not an official artist of the Peruvian establishment, to the same extent, say, as Diego Rivera could be seen to be an official an official artist of the post-revolutionary state in Mexico. Chambi never received any direct help from government institutions in Peru. As told by both the Chilean and Peruvian press, though, Chambi's visit to Chile was at least quasi-official. It was reportedly facilitated and sponsored by the Peruvian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and according to La Nación, Chambi invited the Peruvian ambassador in Chile, Pedro Irigoyen, and other prominent members of the Peruvian diplomatic corps in Santiago to his exhibition that he held in the offices of La Nación in Santiago. Perhaps more significantly, the then president of Chile, Arturo Alessandri, arranged for a private meeting with the Peruvian photographer. Without knowing enough about it, I don't know if that's unusual or how unusual that is for a president to receive in private a visiting photographer. For the Cusqueño newspaper Los Andes, Chambi's trip had one principal objective, and that was to market Peru, and particularly Cusco, as an ideal destination for Chilean holidaymakers. El interés de este viaje reside para nosotros en la propaganda efectiva que con la exhibición de sus fotos ha de hacer Chambi, por el conocimiento de nuestra riqueza arqueológica, contribuyendo así a despertar interés por conocer nuestra región en nuestros vecinos del sur. More than 20 years later, when the national press was celebrating Chambi's 50th anniversary as a professional photographer, El Deber of Arequipa asserted that Chambi had done more for tourism in Peru than all tourism agencies put together. And Chambi himself, both at the time and retrospectively, claimed that one of his main aims as a photographer was to show the world the natural beauty of Peru. More often than not, particularly the natural beauty of the Cusco region. To promote tourism in Peru, or to promote Peruvian tourism, was not, however, Chambi's only objective when he went to Chile in 1936, and he made no secret of this fact, particularly when he was talking to the Chilean press. So as narrated here in the Santiago-based Revista Hoy, Chambi went to Chile as a self-proclaimed representative of the indigenous Quechua race in order to denounce and undermine what he perceived to be or what he had read about Chilean racist attitudes towards indigenous peoples. He leído que en Chile se cree que los indios no tienen cultura, que son bárbaros, que tienen una inferioridad mental y expresiva notables al lado de los blancos o europeos. Yo nunca he creído en eso porque conozco a mis hermanos de raza y a los otros. Pero me parece que más elocuente que una opinión son los testimonios gráficos y por ello he aprendido esa tarea. Llevo en mi archivo más de 200 fotografías de diversos aspectos de la cultura quechua. And then later on, me gustaría que los testigos imparciales y objetivos vieran este acervo. It's interesting here that he's saying that there are many who wouldn't be impartial or objective. Now, por eso haré la exhibición en Viña primero y luego, si es posible,